There's something I didn't fully understand until I've been running this business for years, and it's a little uncomfortable to say out loud. I know more about where this company is going than anybody else that works here. Not because I'm smarter than my team, not because I work harder than they do. It's because I'm the one that lies awake thinking about what's next. I'm the one carrying the 5 year picture around in my head, while everybody else is understandably focused on doing their job well today. Welcome back to Brickonomics, the business of building. I'm your host, Nick Scroggs. In last episode, we talked about why the owner shouldn't be the system, why staying at the center of every decision keeps you as an employee of your own company instead of an actual entrepreneur. This episode is about the next problem that creates. Once you start pulling yourself out of the center, how does everybody else understand what's actually happening and why? The thing that nobody tells you about growth, even your best people, your most loyal, your most tenured employees, don't see the business the same way that you do. Not because they're not sharp enough, not because they don't care. It's because they've never had to. Their job has been to be excellent at their piece of it. Your job has been to hold the whole picture together. Those are fundamentally different vantage points, and the gap between them is invisible right up until something forces that into view. So, what is that? Change. People love structure. They love repeatability. They resist change instinctively, not because they're difficult, but because change is uncomfortable for every single one of us. So, as your business grows and the way that work gets done keeps having to shift, new roles, new responsibilities, new ways of doing things, every one of those shifts lands on real people who didn't choose it and most of the time can't fully see why it's happening. So, the real question that this episode is trying to answer is this: how do you bring real clarity and structure to a growing business without losing your best people in the process and without turning craftsmanship into an assembly line? In our early years, we had one building designer. She was newer to the profession, which is honestly part of the reason why we were able to bring her on to begin with. We didn't have a huge backlog of complicated projects yet, so the work matched her experience level. She did all of our internal building designs, and for where we were as a company at the time, that was a great fit. As we grew, though, the projects themselves changed. They got more complex, more intricate, higher value. The drawing sets that we needed started to outgrow what our designer could reasonably be expected to carry alone. So we made a decision. We brought in a second designer, somebody with significantly more experience, and we put that person above our original hire. I knew this was going to be sensitive. Right about that time, I remember reading a Harvard Business Review article about the tension that shows up when you bring in outside hires above tenured employees and how it can feel less like the business evolving and more like a personal demotion, even when nobody intends it to be that way. So I tried to lead that moment carefully. I got the team together, I referenced the article directly, and I explained that some roles and responsibilities were about to shift and that none of it was personal, that those decisions were decisions that the business needed in order to grow. At the time, I felt genuinely good about the way that I'd handled it. I thought I'd done a thoughtful thing. I'd explained the why. I'd showed them that I understood how it could feel. I'd tried to get ahead of the discomfort instead of just letting it land on the people cold. Here's what actually happened, though. We hired that new designer. He was placed above our original hire, and not so long after that, our original designer left the company. What I've come to understand since then is that a simple explanation of this is what's best for the business isn't going to automatically register with somebody if they can't actually see the long term vision behind it. I could see exactly why this change mattered. I'd been living inside the 5 year picture for months. She hadn't. So the change I experienced as an obvious next step for a growing company landed for her as something much harder to make sense of, no matter how carefully I tried to frame it. Here's the harder truth underneath that story, and it's one that most owners avoid saying out loud because it feels disloyal. The people who got you to where you are right now are not always the people who are going to get you where you're going, and that's okay. That's not a statement about gratitude or loyalty or how much someone's early contribution mattered. Those things aren't in conflict with the business needing different capabilities at different stages of its life. A company at 5 employees needs different things from its people than a company at 50. That's not a betrayal of anyone, it's just what growth actually requires. The problem is what happens when you don't build any structure around that reality. Without systems, this plays out as slow, quiet chaos. Well, that used to be my job, but it's not anymore. That's not how we've always done that. Accountability starts leaking out of the business one gray area at a time because informal trust, the kind that worked fine when there were only six of you, simply can't hold together an organization that's grown past it. The goal is not to strip creativity or judgment out of the business. The goal is making responsibility, timing, and reasoning clear enough that people actually understand who's doing what, when, why it matters, and how their piece connects to everything else that's happening around them. That's not the opposite of craftsmanship. It's the thing that lets craftsmanship survive past the point where it depends entirely on you. Around the same stretch of years, as we kept adding, shifting, and redefining roles, I could feel that resistance building underneath the business generally. It wasn't tied to any specific moment, just a general level of discomfort as things kept changing, and I thought I knew how to fix it. People started telling me in one way or another that they wanted more clarity around what they were actually responsible for. So I tried to give them exactly that: detailed job descriptions, clear roles, clear responsibilities, clean lines around who owns what. And at the time, it felt like I was listening, giving the people what they were asking for. It backfired. And what's interesting is that it didn't just fail to help, it actually created more tension than there had been before. The gray areas that used to be handled by whoever was closest to the problem started turning into excuses. Well, that's not in my job description. I'd given people clarity on paper, but I'd left out the one thing that actually would have mattered: the why. I never connected those responsibilities back to the core processes that they were a part of. So what people experienced wasn't relief, it was a new, more rigid version of the same disconnection they'd been feeling all along. Here's the piece that I missed at the time: we weren't at our final state. We were, and honestly still are, a growing company that adds roles gradually and as it can afford them, not all at once and not according to some finished org chart. A company in that position needs people who are willing to do whatever the moment actually requires, not people who can only operate inside of a black and white job description. We've lived in that uncomfortable middle space for years, and I'll be honest, I don't think that it ever goes away. But here's the real diagnosis, and it took me a little while to see it clearly. Job descriptions standardize, they don't systemize. A job description tells somebody what they're responsible for, X, Y, and Z, without ever telling them why those things matter or how they connect to anything beyond their own desk. And that missing why is what actually damages trust and ownership. It's not that clarity is bad, it's just that a list of duties isn't real clarity, it just looks like it. After the job description approach fell flat, I didn't step back and question the whole strategy. I actually doubled down on it. I spent the next several years building out detailed SOPs for nearly everything I could think of. An initial sales consultation and site visit process so estimators knew exactly what information to gather on a walkthrough. An annual review process for managers and employees designed to take the ambiguity out of the performance evaluations and raises. KPIs tied back to those standard processes. So when somebody told me that they were missing the mark, there was something objective behind it instead of just my opinion. SOPs for data entry into our systems, a defined construction workflow, quality control checklist for every major phase of a build, site work, grading, framing, drywall, painting, all of it. On paper, that's a serious amount of standardization, and it still didn't get me the buy in that I was after. Every new SOP seemed to solve one problem and quietly create another one somewhere else because I hadn't solved the actual issue. Nobody understood the why or how their place connected to the people around them and ultimately to the client. It didn't matter how explicit I made any individual process. The moment that we needed to change it, a new employee, a new role, a new tool, the whole thing would come apart and the "that's not how we used to do it" would start right back up again. That's when it finally landed for me why there was a difference between core processes and SOPs. I'd been building an enormous amount of detailed instruction with no map underneath it. People can follow an SOP perfectly and still have no idea why it matters or what it's connected to. I had the what in exhaustive detail, but I never had the why. A friend of mine had actually pointed out to me a book called Traction well before this had finally clicked. I'd read it, nodded along with the idea of core processes, and then gone right back to building more detailed SOPs anyway. Because on the surface, SOPs felt like the more concrete, more actionable thing to build. It took living through that entire cycle, watching SOP after SOP fail to create real buy in before the actual idea in the book finally landed. The idea is this: instead of documenting individual jobs, you document your core business processes. The whole path that work actually travels through, start to finish, to get a client all the way through your company. Not an SOP for lead intake and isolation, not a separate SOP for estimating sitting off on its own. The actual connected flow of how work moves through your business from the first contact to the finished product. For that, that meant identifying our core processes as a company: HR, admin, finance, sales, marketing, design, and construction operations. None of those exist in isolation. Sales feeds design, design feeds construction operations, admin and finance touch every single one of them. The moment you actually map that out, you stop seeing six separate departments and start seeing one connected system with six major stages. That's the thing that job descriptions and even my mountain of SOPs could never give us. A job description shows one person their narrow slice. An SOP shows them one task in isolation. A documented core process shows everybody, even people who only ever touch one piece of it, how their work depends on the stages before them and how it feeds the stages after them. That's a completely different kind of understanding. It's not here's your list of duties or here's exactly how to do this one thing. It's here's how the whole thing actually works and here's exactly where you fit inside of that. Looking back, both of my earlier attempts were aiming at something real. We genuinely needed consistency across the organization. And honestly, both the job descriptions and the SOPs I built were good work. What was missing wasn't effort or detail. It was knowing which of these two tools actually goes first and why they're not interchangeable. This is the one distinction that would have saved me those extra years if I'd understood it going in. And it's something worth being precise about because I think that a lot of builders mix these two things up. And I did too for a long time. Core processes and standard operating procedures are not the same thing, and they don't do the same job. A core process is the bigger picture, the whole path that work travels through your business, start to finish. Sales to design to construction operations with admin, finance, and HR touching all of it along the way. That's the map. It tells everybody how the pieces connect and how they depend on each other. An SOP is something much narrower. It's the specific, exact way that you want one particular task done every single time with no variation. How a change order gets processed, how a client gets onboarded once a contract is signed, how a punch list gets closed out. The part that matters the most, the core process has to come first. If you start writing SOPs before you've mapped out your core processes, you end up right back where I did: a pile of disconnected instructions with no shared understanding of how any of it matters and where it fits together. SOPs without a core process underneath them are just a fancier version of the same problem. Once your core processes are actually mapped, SOPs have an obvious home. They're not standalone documents floating around. They're the specific, non negotiable steps that live inside of one stage of a core process. The moments where you've decided consistency matters more than individual judgment. Not every step in a core process needs an SOP. In fact, most of them don't. But the ones where getting it wrong is expensive or where consistency protects the client experience, those are worth locking down precisely. That's really the whole hierarchy. Map the core processes first so that everyone understands how the business actually works. Then, and only then, go back and decide which specific steps inside that process are important enough to standardize completely. Here's where this actually pays off, and it circles all the way back to the designer story from earlier in the episode. Once your core processes are documented, adding or shifting a role stops reading as somebody is being pushed out and starts reading as we're adding capacity to move the same process through the system as we grow. That's a real meaningful difference. The process itself doesn't change. We're still doing everything that has to move a client from first contact to finished product. What changes is how many people it takes to carry that process as the work gets more complex. And that's a scaling reality, not a verdict on anyone's value. If I could go back and redo the conversation with my design team, here's one thing that I'd change. Instead of standing up and saying, the business is growing and this isn't personal, I'd point to the actual design process that we have now that's written down and say, here's every stage that has to move through. Here's why one person genuinely can't carry all of it. And this is how our projects have gotten more complex. And here's exactly where you fit into that picture going forward. That gives somebody something tangible to see themselves inside of instead of an abstract appeal for them to just trust me. It might not have changed the outcome, but it would have given her something real to stand on instead of just my word that it wasn't personal. This also changes something for you as an owner, and I didn't really expect this part. When a decision is grounded in a documented process instead of a gut feeling about who should be doing what, you can actually explain it clearly. You can defend it. You're not as exposed to the guilt and second guessing that comes with decisions that feel arbitrary, even when they weren't. That confidence is worth almost as much as the clarity that it gives your team. Here's the main point of this whole episode. You carry information and vision that nobody else in your business has. That's not something to feel guilty about. It's just the nature of the seat that you sit in. But it's also exactly where chaos comes from if you never build a bridge across that gap. Systemization was never about stripping out craftsmanship or creativity, and it was never about drawing rigid little boxes around who's allowed to do what. It's about making the business legible, genuinely understandable to the people that are inside of it. Who does what, when, why it matters, and how their piece connects back to everybody else's. This is how the owner actually stops being the system, not through willpower and not through explaining yourself well enough in a single meaning the way that I once thought it would work. It happens through processes the business can actually run on, ones that hold up whether you're in the room to explain them or not. Next episode, we're going to get even more specific. The first 3 roles that every growing builder actually needs and how to know when you're ready to build them. Thanks for listening to Brickonomics, and I'll see you in the next one.